Lawyers of Reddit, what's the worst way you've seen a person screw over someone else in court, whether it be criminal, civil, or divorce proceedings? I had a client who was accused of a very nasty sexual offense. He had an alibi. He was at work, where he was the boss. He had an employee who could absolutely vouch for his being there. I talked to the employee. Employee confirmed this. It gets closer to the trial, and around the time when I need to send in an alibi notice, which is advance notice to the Crown so that they can investigate the alibi and determine whether or not it's true. But I am being careful, so I call the employee up again. Turns out my client fired him in the interim, and so the employee quite candidly tells me, "Oh, yeah, he was definitely at work, but that's not what I'll say in court. Frick that guy, he is going down. I did not call him as a witness, or file the alibi notice. Still won the trial, but if I hadn't thought to call the guy, or if he'd been less candid, my client would have been fricked hard. Sex offender registry, jail time, the works. Completely innocent." Well, not my story, but a prior boss's story. They had a drunk driver kills a car worth of people case at the time when they were a general practitioner. My boss was representing the family that got hit, one where the 2 kids and the wife had died, but the father had not, and wanted the college guy's drunk driving skin to be mounted on a wall. This was back before Facebook was commonly used in court proceedings and before tons of people realized that crap is too great for any attorney worth their weight in salt to pass up. So, the kid, drunk driving college kid, had managed to get the judge's sympathy during the first part of the hearing by saying he was sorry, haunted, never going to drink again, this was going to ruin his life, etc. The judge seemed to really be eating it up. Then comes my boss and immediately burns this kid's remorse to the ground by showing numerous Facebook statuses and photos of them binge drinking, partying, and even joking about driving drunk from the date of the accident up until a night ago. The kid looked like he was being forced to swallow hot coals and the judge was absolutely livid. Needless to say, the kid had to do way more than just apologize and be remorseful after that. More of a case of screwing himself over, but here goes. This was a case another prosecutor in my office had a few years back. 30-year-old defendant was charged with assault of a child after he got his girlfriend's 14-year-old sister pregnant. She actually kept the baby, so the police just waited and got a paternity test. No surprise, defendant was the father. Defendant wanted probation. Prosecutor refused to offer it. He decided to plead guilty and have a jury trial on punishment. Here in Texas, you can choose to have the jury set punishment. Evidence mostly proceeded as expected. The victim testified to having consensual, aside from not being old enough to consent, intercourse with the defendant, getting pregnant, etc. Paternity test introduced. Defendant took the stand. His version of events was that he snuck into victim's room at night, covered her mouth, and held her down while he forcibly had intercourse with her against her will. It seemed like his own lawyer had no idea that's the story he settled on. The jury deliberated about 15 minutes before returning a verdict of 17 years, the maximum possible, as charged was 20. When interviewed by the attorneys afterwards, one of them said they decided on 17 years so the defendant would never forget the age of consent in Texas again. Someone I knew had a Predatory case where she had to defend a person who had been charged with a criminal offense. Don't know what, confidential and whatnot. Even though the police and could pretty much pinpoint the crime to her client, there was no evidence to tie him to the crime, circumstantial at best. She had instructed him to shut up and let her do the talking during the trial, as from experience the client sometimes does not know how to answer a question properly. She pleads and can show that the court has nothing on her client. She feels that for once, a Predatory case is going her way. After her plea, the judge thanks her for her plea and turns to her client. He asks if the client has something to add to the plea. Client looks at her, back at the judge, tears well up in his eyes, and he blurts out, "I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again." She threw her notes and everything else she had in her hands at the client. Now convict. Apparently, she basically got screwed by her own client, who screwed himself even worse. I'm currently representing a sweet old lady on a case. Long story short, this lady's neighbor convinces her that her house is basically unsellable, that her house requires all sorts of repairs, the repairs to the house would bankrupt her, and that she should just sell the house. To him, He shows up at her house the next day with documents to sign. She has no idea what's going on, doesn't read anything, actually has an eye condition, and signs everything. When she finally sees a lawyer to close the deal, he says, "WTF, you can't do this." You see, the price of the transaction was about 36% of what the house is actually worth, and there weren't any repairs that needed to be done that would justify the price. Not kidding. It was stuff like fixing a faucet in the bathroom. Also, she didn't understand that she would have nowhere to live afterwards. Old lady thought she could just stay in the house until she died. To make matters worse, she's living off a modest pension and the other side is suing for the house. They're essentially trying to get her to cave because her legal fees are getting exorbitant. I hate people. A witness for the plaintiff in a civil suit, who was a co-worker of the plaintiff, testified very strongly against the company and in favor of the plaintiff. I questioned her about bias toward the plaintiff, if they knew each other well, were friends, etc. She said, "No, just friendly co-workers, work friends at best." I pinned her to it. When I got a chance to cross-examine the plaintiff, she had no choice but to burn her witness's credibility, because not only were they very close friends, but they had become sisters-in-law just a few years before. I still don't get why people want to fight small bias by destroying their credibility, but it happens more than you think. Not a lawyer, but this story always gets me. My biological grandmother died 20 years ago of ovarian cancer. She left all her money, trusts, bonds to my grandfather to use while alive and disperse after death. My grandfather remarried something like 15 years ago to my step-grandma. My grandfather ended up dying first a few years back. My step-aunt is a greedy bee who lives on the opposite side of the country. She's lived off of her mother and my grandfather for all of her life. She'd come over and take them on vacation where she'd use their money to buy herself things and get a free skiing trip about 8x a year. After my grandfather passed, my step-grandma had to move where her children live to get care for dementia. My step-aunt has access to not only her own mother's estate but my grandfather's as well to take care of her needs. That wasn't enough. She decided to try and sue my dad and uncle for their dead biological mother's estate. My dad is bilaterally paralyzed and in a wheelchair. My uncle is a triple bypass survivor with a pacemaker and multiple stints. Both are on fixed disability income. The court date came and I literally wheeled my dad in while my uncle walked with a cane. My step-aunt is entirely able-bodied and rolling in the millions my step-grandma and grandfather worked their whole lives to earn. The judge took one look at the whole picture and she was absolutely denied access to my biological grandmother's estate. We were there for less than an hour. Defendant trying to overturn default judgment claims person process server served wasn't him, couldn't possibly be him, etc. At hearing, process server testifies he clearly recognizes defendant there in court 2 years later because defendant physically threatened him at time of service, made himself pretty memorable. Oh, and process server was sure he served the right guy. BC at time of service, he had photo of defendant, which my client had helpfully sourced on mugshots.com. Sitting waiting for my client and the judge is giving a mass colloquy for an alternative program on a DUI, basically probation. Question: has anyone consumed alcohol or taken drugs in the last 24 hours? Obvious answer aside, one dude proudly raises his hand. I smoked some dope last night. He did not get probation. Not a lawyer, but my dad is a physician and is sometimes called as a professional witness in cases of malpractice. In one memorable case, a family was suing a doctor for something fairly frivolous, and my dad was a witness for the defense. The lawyer representing the family was cross-examining my dad, and brought up a chapter in a medical textbook and asked my dad to read a highlighted paragraph. He does, and the lawyer says something to the effect of, "So, what you just read means, blah blah medical thing." My dad confidently replied, "No, it does not mean that." Lawyer: "No, but if you read this, the author clearly states, blah blah medical thing." Dad: "No, really, that's not what the author means." Lawyer: "How do you know that's not what the author meant?" Dad: "Well, because I wrote it." Judge basically facepalmed while the lawyer mimicked a goldfish and stared at the author name on the chapter. Basically the best moment of my dad's professional life. 2 men in criminal client situations to counter them screwing themselves over. One of the very few family law cases I handled as a young atty sticks out to me though. Young woman and young man have child. Young woman seeks divorce from young man because he enjoys the thug life. He had recently been arrested and charged for possession W and to distribute M, felony, and in possession of a firearm, and lawful carry. Young man doesn't like her leaving him. He hires a local big name top divorce atty. Granted, very rural area. Gets temp divorce order entered saying she cannot have overnight guests of the opposite gender. Common in rural conservative areas. Think it's mostly a thing of the past in more urban places. Young woman starts seeing someone new. Young man is very upset about this. Has his fancy lawyer ask for a hearing accusing her of violating court order and seeking full custody, on top of atty fees. Young woman, on advice from a mutual friend, hires me for this hearing. I go into hearing with a copy of his probation arrangement on his posse W intend to sell and unlawful carry. He hasn't told his atty about this, and she is unaware. She calls him up, establishes how my client had her new BF over on X, Y, Z nights. Judge is very conservative, not pleased. Then, opposing counsel passes the witness. I ask him if he has a job. Number. What do you do for money? Things here and there. Oh, Ms. Opposing counsel is awfully expensive. Do you sell M? What? Have you ever sold drugs to make ends meet? I number introduce a copy of his guilty plea and straight probation sentencing. Judge is now staring daggers at him. I lean over to my client sitting next to me and whisper, if you took a drug test today, be honest, would you be completely clean? Yes. I ask the young man, when was the last time you did M? Atty objects. But judge overrules. I know this judge will drug test people on the spot as he is also the misdemeanor drug court judge. It's been years. I'm clean. So, if you were tested, you'd be clean? Yes. Opposing counsel asks the same of my client. We agree. Judge has them both tested. He tests positive for M. My client is clean. Judge denies his motion and asks me to send in new temp orders where young man is required to maintain employment and start paying child support and places him on supervised visits. Icing on the cake, opposing counsel actually calls me and leaves me a voicemail congratulating me on, and I quote, handing her ass to her for the first time in a long time. Not someone else, but himself. The guy and his lawyer missed court appearances, sometimes one of them, sometimes both, with little or no warning and with suspect excuses. It started getting ridiculous and we kept pointing out holes in his story, like he said he left for another country without knowing about the appearance, but his lawyer stood in court and said he told him beforehand, or all of a sudden he was in a former Soviet bloc country for fertility treatments and it would ruin everything if he came back now, or when he was visiting dying relatives on another continent, or he was going to the airport when he had to rush to the hospital and showed us an admitting form in another language that we translated. It showed he was there but also that he was discharged. He also tried firing his attorney and saying he needed more time to brief a new attorney, who at the next appearance would say he hasn't been able to talk to his client so he needs to adjourn. Or that he hasn't been paid and his client is basically an arse and he needs to be relieved. We kept saying to the judge he was doing it to stall but the judge kept giving him the benefit of the doubt. We even showed him other cases where he skipped appearances and the judge's threatened sanctions. Until finally he didn't show up for an appearance where the judge had specifically told him, I don't care if you're meeting with the Pope, I'm ordering you to be here. Boom, his answer was stricken. Default judgment in full was granted to our side. Neither he nor his lawyer showed up for the hearing where the judge determined exactly how much of a judgment we should get, and then had the nerve to file a motion that the judgment was unfair because he didn't get a chance to dispute anything. I'm a paralegal. The best situations are when we get a sovereign citizen, someone in the USA who thinks that the US laws do not apply to them for a vast variety of reasons, hire us but won't let us do anything on their case. We've had to actually fire a bunch of clients because they have gone against our rules like, don't send a letter to the judge, don't write your own motions, don't announce that you're not Mark Smith because Mark Smith has capital letters and you were born with lowercase letters, etc. Honestly, a whole thread on these people wouldn't be enough. A wife filed for a restraining order because she wanted the house during divorce. Husband has good job, like $200k per year. Employer finds out about restraining order. Husband is fired. He was very specialized employee, so only job he can find closer to house, ex-wife, and daughter is $50K. House gets foreclosed. Child support at less than $500 per month. Wife has to get job as waitress. 4 cars get repossessed. Kind of a self-screw, but the MPAA entered DVD John's code for breaking DVD copy protection as part of their lawsuit into their evidence, which then became public record. The code that breaks DVD copy protection was now available to the entire world, defeating the entire purpose of their lawsuit. There was a case going on in my town between a father and son that was hilarious. The dad is a big-time personal injury attorney around here who started his own firm under his name, George Sink, and his son ended up joining the family business. Well, they had a falling out, so the son goes off to start his own firm. He has his dad's name, so the dad is suing the son for using the name he gave him to start his own law firm. This wasn't my case, but followed it closely because it was an acquaintance's divorce proceedings. He and his now ex-wife shared some commercial property that was worth some dough. They were both on the paperwork, had access to the same info. Well, some crap hit the fan and the property was in arrears, and I think some lien was filed. The husband would try to talk to his then wife about the whole thing and she would blow him off. Not only would she ignore him and the finances, she started cheating on him. Fast forward to divorce. It's contentious and they get down to fighting for the primary residence, whose market value unencumbered is much less than the commercial building. She demanded the house and the husband effectively offered to give her the commercial building if he could keep the residence. She never paid attention to how bad off the commercial building was, and for some strange reason her lawyer didn't do any due diligence, so they took the deal. I don't know if the asset allocation included any saving conditions or caveats for the ex-wife, but I did like to see that her own disinterest may have led to bargaining for an underwater property instead of a paid-off house. I have been in dispute with British Gas for around 10 years. Every now and again they take me to court. Every time I win and we go away for another few years. The last time I lawyered up, it's in a magistrate's even though it's a civil matter. My solicitor waited for the British Gas guy to swear his oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, etc. Then asked him what he knew of the previous court cases. When the guy said he didn't know anything about them, my solicitor ripped into him saying he just claimed to tell the whole truth, so clearly nothing he says can be trusted. It went on for a few minutes. It was kind of brutal. The magistrates agreed and we walked away with £600 in costs. It was a joy to watch this bloke who was all, "We're coming to make entry to your house and the police will help," before we went in be told to sit down and not say anything else unless he was asked a question. Not a lawyer, but when my Phil and Mill got divorced, she wanted to file jointly for the previous year because they were still married. They would have gotten a decent refund. He insisted on filing separately, despite the fact that he would owe $4K, because he wanted her to also owe the IRS. He did it to frost her ass. I was in the tax field for years, and I cannot stress enough how spiteful and mean ex-spouses, ex-partners can be, especially when it comes to money and tax credit deductions. I had a guy admit to being high on M when he totaled his car and put himself in the hospital during a probation violation hearing for something completely unrelated. The cops picked him up at the hospital when he was discharged. Then he started mouthing off to the cop about frick the judge, frick probation, frick the police. Nobody asked him why he got in the accident. For all I knew, there weren't even DUI charges against him related to the accident. He had just stopped showing up to his probation meetings, so a warrant was put out. But he was kind enough to run his mouth for 5 minutes and admit to a bunch of crap he shouldn't have admitted to. When asked if I wanted to make any closing remarks, I said something like, "No, Your Honor, the record is crystal clear why the state is requesting Mr. Defendant to have his sentence reinstated." And she gave one of those freaking amen kind of looks. You have been visited by the Science Doggo. Upvote now and you will get high grades and good results within the next week. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check out another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day, you magnificent people.